John always thought the most exciting thing that could happen on his farm was the time a cow gave birth to twins during a thunderstorm. That was the pinnacle of drama in his quiet, predictable life. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for the day he woke up to find an airport sprouting in the middle of his cornfield like some kind of dystopian crop. It started innocently enough. John shuffled out onto his porch with his usual morning coffee, ready to greet another day of plowing, planting, and occasionally yelling at squirrels. But instead of the serene view of his rolling fields, he was greeted by chaos. Bulldozers tearing into the earth, workers in neon vests shouting orders, and, most bizarrely, a man in a suit holding a clipboard and looking very pleased with himself. John blinked, then blinked again. Surely this was some kind of dream, the kind you have after eating too much chili before bed. But no, there it was, as real as the coffee mug trembling in his hand. A massive sign loomed over the scene, its bold letters screaming, "Future site of Willowbrook Regional Airport. Approved by HOA. HOA." John muttered aloud, his voice dripping with disbelief. What HOA? I don't even live in a neighborhood. He set down his coffee and stomped toward the chaos, his boots crunching against the gravel driveway with purpose. As he got closer, the details became even more absurd. There was a taco truck parked near what used to be his favorite oak tree, serving breakfast burritos to construction workers who were apparently building his land into someone else's dream project. "Excuse me," John shouted, waving his arms like a man trying to flag down a runaway train. "What in tarnation is going on here?" One of the workers, a burly guy in a hard hat, looked up from his burrito long enough to shrug and point toward the man with the clipboard. Clipboard guy noticed John approaching and smiled as if they were old friends meeting for brunch. "Good morning," clipboard guy chirped. "Can I help you?" "Yes," John said sharply. "You can start by explaining why there's an airport being built on my farm." Clipboard guy's smile didn't falter. If anything, it grew wider, which only made John more suspicious. "Ah, you must be Mr. Thompson. Lovely piece of land you've got here." "Yeah, I know," John snapped. "That's why I own it." "Well," clipboard guy said with a chuckle that made John want to throw him into a hay baler. "Technically, this land has been designated as part of the Willowbrook Community Improvement Initiative." John stared at him blankly. "The what now?" "The Willowbrook Community Improvement Initiative," clipboard guy repeated slowly, as if John were hard of hearing or perhaps just very stupid. "It's all been approved by the HOA." John felt his blood pressure spike so high he briefly wondered if he might spontaneously combust. "I don't have an HOA. I'm not part of any neighborhood. This is my farm." Clipboard guy gave him a patronizing pat on the shoulder that nearly sent John into orbit. "Oh, I understand your confusion. But you see, your property borders Willowbrook Estates, the lovely residential community just over yonder, and their HOA has jurisdiction over certain adjacent areas deemed beneficial for community development." "Beneficial for who?" John demanded. "Well," clipboard guy said with another infuriating chuckle, "for everyone. Think about it. Direct flights from Willowbrook Regional Airport, increased property values, a bustling local economy." John opened his mouth to respond but found himself momentarily speechless. Not because he agreed, but because he couldn't decide whether to laugh or scream first. "I didn't agree to this," he finally managed to sputter. "Oh, no need," clipboard guy said brightly. "The HOA took care of all the approvals on your behalf." "My behalf?" John repeated incredulously. "Yes," clipboard guy confirmed with a nod so smug it could have powered an entire solar farm. "It's all perfectly legal." John clenched his fists so tightly that if he'd been holding coal, it would have turned into diamonds. Without another word, he spun on his heel and marched back toward his house. He needed answers and possibly a lawyer. By the time he reached his porch, John had already pieced together what had happened, or at least who was behind it. Karen Whitmore, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association and self-appointed queen of suburban tyranny. Karen had been pestering him for years to sell his land for various community projects. First it was a dog park, then it was a golf course, then it was something called a wellness retreat. which sounded suspiciously like code for overpriced yoga classes and kale smoothies. Each time, John had politely declined, though by politely, he meant slamming the door in her face. But apparently Karen wasn't one to take no for an answer. As John sat down at his kitchen table and began rifling through old property deeds and zoning documents, which were about as exciting as watching paint dry, one thing became abundantly clear. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was war. And if Karen thought she could bulldoze her way across his land without so much as a handshake or a cup of coffee first, she had another thing coming. John didn't waste any time. Fueled by righteous indignation and 3 cups of coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon, he hopped into his old pickup truck and drove straight to the heart of suburban tyranny, Karen Whitmore's house. It wasn't hard to find. Her McMansion was the one that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought dolphins made excellent head shapes. As John pulled up, he noticed a small gathering on Karen's patio. There she was, perched on a wicker chair like some kind of HOA monarch, surrounded by her loyal subjects. They were sipping mimosas and laughing about something that probably involved ruining someone else's life. John slammed his truck door shut with enough force to make Karen glance over, her smile freezing in place as she spotted him stomping across her perfectly manicured lawn. "John!" Karen called out, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "What a surprise! Care for a mimosa? I don't want your fancy drink," John snapped, pointing an accusatory finger at her. "I want answers. Why is there an airport being built on my farm?" Karen tilted her head in mock confusion, as if she'd just been asked why the sky was blue. "Oh dear, is that your land? We assumed it was an used community space." "An used community space?" John sputtered, his voice rising an octave. "It's my livelihood. My cows graze there. My crops grow there. I buried my dog there." Karen raised an eyebrow but didn't lose her composure. "Well, John, progress waits for no one. Willowbrook needs this airport to thrive." "Thrive?" John echoed incredulously. "The only thing thriving right now is your ego." Karen let out a delicate laugh that made John want to throw her mimosa into the nearest hedge dolphin. Now, let's not get emotional. The HOA has already approved everything." John clenched his fists so tightly, he could have crushed walnuts barehanded. "You didn't even ask me. You didn't get my permission. You didn't." Karen interrupted with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Oh, don't be so melodramatic, John. This is for the greater good." "The greater good?" John repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The only thing this airport is good for is ruining my life." Karen sighed dramatically and gestured toward her brunch guests for support. One of them, a woman wearing a sweater with actual pearls sewn onto it, chimed in enthusiastically. "Think of all the jobs it'll create. And direct flights to Miami," added another. John stared at them in disbelief before turning back to Karen. "You people are unbelievable." Karen smiled sweetly and stood up from her chair, clearly ready to end the conversation on her terms. "Well, John, if you have any concerns, feel free to bring them up at our next HOA meeting." John opened his mouth to respond but quickly realized it was pointless. Karen wasn't just ignoring him. She was steamrolling him with the kind of arrogance only someone who owned matching monogram towels could muster. He stormed off before he said something that would land him in jail, or worse, on Karen's Christmas card list. Back at home, John decided he needed reinforcements. He called Marcus, his lawyer and longtime friend, a man who had once successfully sued a car dealership for selling him a vehicle that smelled like wet socks. Marcus arrived within the hour, armed with legal pads and an expression that said he was ready to fight anyone who dared cross his client. "So let me get this straight," Marcus said after listening to John's rant about bulldozers and brunch mimosas. "The HOA claims they have jurisdiction over your land?" "Exactly," John replied. Marcus frowned and began flipping through zoning regulations like a man possessed. After several minutes of silence punctuated only by the sound of pages turning, he looked up with a triumphant grin. "They missed something," Marcus said. "What?" John asked eagerly. Marcus held up one of the documents and tapped it with his pen. "Your land isn't just farmland. It's classified as part of a protected environmental zone." That means they can't develop it without federal approval. John blinked in surprise before breaking into a grin so wide it could have rivaled Karen's fake politeness. You mean they can't build the airport? Not legally, Marcus confirmed. John felt a surge of hope, and something else. Pure, unfiltered pettiness. The next morning, Marcus accompanied John to the construction site armed with copies of zoning laws and environmental regulations thicker than a phone book from 1995. Clipboard Guy was back, still looking smug despite the fact that he was about to be metaphorically drop-kicked by legal paperwork. Good morning, Clipboard Guy chirped as they approached. Marcus didn't waste any time. He thrust the documents into Clipboard Guy's hands and said firmly, "Cease and desist immediately." Clipboard Guy blinked at him like a deer caught in headlights, or perhaps more accurately, like a man who had just realized his clipboard wasn't going to save him from impending doom. What do you mean?" Clipboard Guy stammered. "I mean," Marcus replied with the kind of tone that could make grown men cry. "This project is illegal under federal law." Clipboard Guy glanced nervously at the papers before muttering something about needing to call Karen. "Oh, please do," Marcus said cheerfully. "She'll love hearing this." Within hours, construction had ground to a halt as workers packed up their tools and taco trucks drove away in defeat. Karen showed up shortly afterward looking livid, and for once, she wasn't holding a mimosa. "This is outrageous," she exclaimed as she stormed toward John and Marcus. "What's outrageous?" Marcus countered calmly. "Is your blatant disregard for property rights and environmental protection laws." Karen opened her mouth to argue but quickly realized she had no leg to stand on, or perhaps more accurately, no runway to build on. As she retreated back to her McMansion in defeat, John couldn't help but feel victorious. Not just because he'd stopped the airport, but because he'd done it while exposing Karen's arrogance for what it truly was. Hot air masquerading as progress. For now, his farm was safe and so were his cows. John had hoped that shutting down the construction site would be the end of it. He imagined Karen retreating to her McMansion, licking her wounds, and perhaps even reconsidering her life choices. But he had underestimated one crucial detail. Karen Whitmore was not the kind of person who took no for an answer. She was the kind of person who saw no as a personal challenge, a dare even, and John had unknowingly just declared war. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter, delivered to John's mailbox in an envelope so thick it could have doubled as body armor. The return address was stamped with the HOA logo, which John now associated with pure evil. He tore it open and began reading aloud to his cows, who were grazing nearby and seemed mildly interested in his plight. "Dear Mr. Thompson," John read, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "It has come to our attention that your actions have caused undue delays to the Willowbrook Regional Airport project, which has been approved for the betterment of our community." He paused and looked at Bessie, his favorite cow. "Betterment of the community? They're building a runway over your grazing field." Bessie mooed in agreement. John continued reading. "As such, we are issuing a formal cease and desist order against you for obstructing progress. Failure to comply will result in legal action." John snorted so loudly that Bessie flinched. "Legal action? Oh, they're really pulling out all the stops now." The next day, Marcus arrived at John's farm armed with more legal documents than should reasonably fit in a briefcase. He skimmed through the HOA's letter before shaking his head in disbelief. "They're bluffing," Marcus said confidently. "Are you sure?" John asked. "Karen doesn't seem like the bluffing type." Marcus smirked. "Trust me, John. I've dealt with people like her before. They think they can intimidate you into submission because they have fancy titles and expensive stationery." John nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done yet. And he was right. 2 days later, Karen showed up on his farm unannounced, flanked by 2 men in suits who looked like they'd been hired specifically for their ability to scowl. She was holding yet another clipboard because apparently she couldn't function without one, and wearing sunglasses despite the fact that it was cloudy. "John," Karen said, her tone oozing fake politeness, "I thought we should have a little chat." "I'm not signing anything," John replied immediately. Karen laughed, a sound so forced it could have been mistaken for choking. "Oh, don't be silly. I'm not here for signatures." "Then what do you want?" John asked warily. Karen gestured toward the two men behind her. "This is Mr. Prescott and Mr. Daniels from Willowbrook Legal Counsel." John raised an eyebrow. "You brought lawyers to my farm?" "They're here to help clarify some things," Karen said smoothly. Marcus stepped forward before John could respond. "And I'm here to clarify that this conversation is over unless you have something legally binding to present." Karen's smile faltered slightly but quickly recovered. "Well, Marcus, since you're here, perhaps you can explain why Mr. Thompson refuses to cooperate with a project that has already been approved by the HOA." Marcus didn't miss a beat. "Because your approval is meaningless without his consent." Karen's sunglasses couldn't hide her narrowing eyes as she retorted. "The HOA has jurisdiction over adjacent properties deemed beneficial for community development. And yet," Marcus countered, pulling out a document from his briefcase like it was Excalibur, "this particular property is classified as protected farmland under federal law." Karen glanced at the document but didn't take it from him. Instead, she turned back to John with a saccharine smile that made his skin crawl. "John," she said softly, as if they were old friends discussing gardening tips instead of mortal enemies locked in battle. "Don't you want what's best for Willowbrook?" "What's best for Willowbrook," John replied firmly, "is not building an airport on my land." Karen sighed dramatically and turned to her lawyers as if seeking moral support, or perhaps just someone else to blame for her failure. "Well," she said finally, "if you insist on being difficult." Marcus interrupted her before she could finish. "If you insist on trespassing again, I'll file an injunction faster than you can say HOA bylaws." Karen's face twitched slightly before she plastered on another fake smile and retreated with her entourage in tow. For a moment, John thought he might actually be free of her, but once again, he underestimated just how far Karen was willing to go. The next week was a whirlwind of petty retaliation on Karen's part. First came the noise complaints, letters accusing John's cows of mooing too loudly during HOA meetings, which were held half a mile away. Then came the accusations that his tractor violated local emission standards, despite being older than most HOA members. Finally, Karen began spreading rumors around Willowbrook Estates that John was planning to turn his farm into a landfill. A claim so ridiculous even Marcus couldn't stop laughing when he heard it. But John wasn't laughing anymore. He was plotting. Late one night, after feeding his cows and double-checking his property boundaries for what felt like the 100th time, John sat down at his kitchen table with Marcus and hatched a plan. A plan so devious it would make Karen regret ever stepping foot on his land. It started with paperwork, lots of paperwork, and ended with something Karen would never see coming. Revenge served cold and legal. By sunrise, John felt more prepared than ever to face whatever nonsense Karen threw his way next. And this time, he wouldn't just defend himself. He'd make sure she learned what happens when you mess with a farmer who knows his rights. John woke up the next morning with a sense of purpose and a touch of spite. He wasn't just going to defend his farm. He was going to make Karen Whitmore regret every single decision that had led her to believe she could steamroll him. Revenge was brewing, and it smelled better than his morning coffee. The first step in John's plan involved paperwork, the kind of paperwork that made lawyers sweat and bureaucrats cry. Marcus, ever the legal wizard, had spent all night drafting a formal complaint to both the county zoning board and the Environmental Protection Agency. It was a masterpiece of legal jargon, packed with enough citations and footnotes to make Karen's clipboard look like a child's coloring book. "This," Marcus said as he handed John the stack of documents, "is how we hit them where it hurts." John grinned as he flipped through the pages. "You mean their egos?" "That too," Marcus replied, "but mostly their wallets." Armed with Marcus's legal arsenal, John drove straight to the county courthouse and filed every single complaint. By lunchtime, he had effectively buried Karen's airport project under a mountain of red tape so dense it would take years to untangle. But John wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Step 2 of his plan was pure genius, or at least that's what Marcus called it when John explained it over lunch. It involved leveraging the one thing Karen hadn't accounted for: public opinion. John knew that Willowbrook Estates thrived on gossip. The HOA meetings were less about community improvement and more about who had the audacity to install a mailbox that wasn't regulation beige. If there was one thing these people loved more than their perfectly trimmed lawns, it was drama, and John was about to give them plenty of it. That afternoon, John printed out flyers detailing Karen's attempt to illegally seize his land for her airport project. He made sure to include every juicy detail: the trespassing bulldozers, the bogus cease and desist letter, and even Karen's ridiculous noise complaints about his cows. At the bottom of each flyer, he added a bold headline: "Is this who you want running your HOA?" With Marcus's help, John distributed the flyers throughout Willowbrook Estates. They stuffed mailboxes, pinned them to community bulletin boards, and even handed them out at the local grocery store. By evening, the neighborhood was buzzing with outrage, and not just at Karen. "I heard she tried to build a runway over his crops," one woman whispered to her neighbor. "And she accused his cows of mooing too loudly," another chimed in. "She's gone mad with power," someone else declared dramatically. Karen, oblivious to the storm brewing around her, was hosting yet another HOA meeting in her backyard when she first caught wind of John's campaign. She noticed the whispers spreading through her guests like wildfire and immediately demanded answers. "What's going on?" Karen asked sharply as she approached a small group huddled near the mimosa table. One of them hesitated before handing her one of John's flyers. Karen scanned it quickly, her face turning redder with each word. "This is slander," she exclaimed, crumpling the flyer in her hand. "It's not slander if it's true," someone muttered under their breath. Karen spun around to glare at them but found herself facing an unexpected mutiny. The very people who had once worshipped her now looked at her with suspicion, and perhaps even a hint of amusement. Meanwhile, back on his farm, John was celebrating his small victory with a slice of pie and a well-earned nap. But his peace didn't last long. By sunset, Karen had regrouped and launched her counterattack. The next day, John received yet another letter from the HOA, this one accusing him of defamation and threatening further legal action. But instead of feeling intimidated, John laughed so hard he nearly choked on his coffee. "Defamation?" he said aloud to Bessie, who seemed unimpressed by Karen's antics. "She defamed herself." Marcus agreed wholeheartedly when he arrived later that morning with an updated strategy. "Let her threaten all she wants," Marcus said confidently. "She doesn't have a leg to stand on." But Karen wasn't relying on legs. She was relying on sheer stubbornness and an inflated sense of self-importance. She doubled down on her efforts to discredit John by spreading rumors that he was planning to sell his farm to developers for a strip mall. A claim so absurd even Willowbrook Estates couldn't take it seriously. "I heard he wants to build a bowling alley," one resident said skeptically. "No way," another replied. "John doesn't even bowl." Karen's attempts at sabotage only fueled John's resolve. He decided it was time for step 3, exposing Karen's shady dealings once and for all. With Marcus leading the charge, they began digging into HOA records, and what they found was nothing short of gold. Emails between Karen and local developers revealed that she had promised them exclusive rights to build on John's land in exchange for kickbacks disguised as community donations. There were also invoices for expensive dinners charged to HOA funds and receipts for items like designer handbags labeled as office supplies. Armed with this evidence, Marcus filed yet another complaint, this time directly with the State Attorney General's office. Within days, investigators were knocking on Karen's door, demanding answers about her misuse of HOA funds and illegal agreements with developers. The fallout was swift and brutal. Karen resigned as HOA president under pressure from both residents and authorities. Her airport project was officially canceled, and she faced hefty fines for violating zoning laws and environmental regulations. As news of Karen's downfall spread through Willowbrook Estates, John couldn't help but feel victorious. Not just because he'd saved his farm, but because he'd exposed Karen for what she truly was, a tyrant masquerading as a community leader. For now, life returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after taking down an HOA president single-handedly. John sat on his porch that evening with a slice of pie in one hand and a glass of lemonade in the other, watching his cows graze peacefully in their rightful field. "Looks like we won," he said softly to Bessie. Bessie mooed in agreement, and for once, there wasn't anyone around to complain about it. For a brief, shining moment, John thought the battle was over. Karen Whitmore had been dethroned, the airport project was dead, and his farm was safe. He even allowed himself a small celebration. A quiet evening on his porch with a cold beer and the satisfaction of knowing he'd taken down the most tyrannical HOA president in Willowbrook history. But, as it turns out, Karen wasn't just going to slink away into obscurity. No, Karen was going to go out swinging, and she had one last trick up her perfectly tailored sleeve. The trouble began a week after Karen's resignation. John was out in his field, repairing a fence that one of his cows had decided to test for structural integrity, when he noticed something strange. A group of people, strangers, were standing at the edge of his property, pointing at various parts of his land and jotting things down in notebooks. One of them even had a drone buzzing overhead, snapping pictures like it was auditioning for National Geographic. John wiped the sweat from his brow and marched over to confront them. "Can I help you folks with something?" he asked, trying to keep his tone polite despite the fact that they were clearly trespassing. A woman in a blazer so sharp it could have cut glass stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson?" she asked, her voice clipped and professional. "That's me," John replied warily. "I'm Linda Carter," she said, handing him a business card that identified her as a representative from the County Planning Commission. "We're here to conduct an environmental impact assessment." John blinked. "An environmental what now?" "An environmental impact assessment," Linda repeated slowly, as if she were explaining it to a particularly dim-witted child. "It's standard procedure for properties that may be in violation of local conservation ordinances." John stared at her, dumbfounded. "Violation? My farm is protected under federal law." Linda gave him a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, well, we've received some complaints suggesting otherwise." "Complaints?" John repeated, his voice rising an octave. "From who?" "I'm not at liberty to disclose that information," Linda said primly. But John didn't need her to say it. He knew exactly who was behind this. Karen Whitmore. The woman might have lost her HOA throne, but she wasn't about to let John off the hook without one last attempt to make his life miserable. Linda and her team spent the next several hours poking around John's property, like they were auditioning for a reality show called America's Next Top Bureaucrat. They took soil samples, measured water levels in his pond, and even examined his compost pile with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. By the time they left, John was fuming. He called Marcus immediately and explained what had happened. "She's trying to weaponize the County Planning Commission against me," John said angrily. Marcus sighed on the other end of the line. "Of course she is. Can they actually do anything?" John asked. "Not unless they find evidence of a violation," Marcus replied. "And knowing you, your farm is probably more environmentally friendly than half the parks in this county." John felt a small surge of relief but remained cautious. He knew Karen wouldn't stop until she'd thrown every petty tactic in her arsenal at him. Sure enough, over the next few days, more inspectors showed up unannounced. One from animal control, to investigate alleged mistreatment of his cows, another from the fire department to assess potential fire hazards in his barn, and even someone from the health department who seemed deeply concerned about the cleanliness of his chicken coop. Each time, John greeted them with a mixture of politeness and exasperation. Each time, they left empty-handed because there was nothing to find. No violations, no hazards, no reason for concern. But that didn't stop them from coming back. By the end of the week, John had had enough. It was time to go on offense. With Marcus's help, he filed complaints of his own, against Karen this time. He reported her for harassment, abuse of power during her time as HOA president, and filing false claims with government agencies. He also reached out to local media outlets and shared his story with anyone who would listen. To John's surprise and delight, his tale struck a chord with people far beyond Willowbrook Estates. News outlets picked up the story and ran headlines like, "Farmer Fights Back Against HOA Tyranny," and "The Man Who Stood Up to Suburbia's Worst Nightmare." Social media exploded with support for John, with hashtags like #JusticeForJohn and #DownWithKaren trending nationwide. Karen, meanwhile, found herself facing public scrutiny like never before. Her once pristine reputation as a community leader was now tarnished by accusations of pettiness and vindictiveness. Even her former allies in the HOA began distancing themselves from her. But Karen wasn't done yet, or so she thought. One morning, as John was enjoying his coffee on the porch, a ritual he'd come to cherish even more during this ordeal, Marcus called with some unexpected news. "You're not going to believe this," Marcus said, barely able to contain his laughter. "What?" John asked suspiciously. "Karen tried to file another complaint against you. This time claiming your cows are causing air pollution." John nearly spit out his coffee. "Air pollution? From my cows?" "Yes," Marcus said between chuckles. "Apparently she thinks their emissions are contributing to climate change." John couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. "She's really grasping at straws now." "She is," Marcus agreed. "And it's backfiring spectacularly." As it turned out, Karen's latest stunt had pushed even her most loyal supporters over the edge. The idea that she would go after a farmer for something as ridiculous as cow flatulence was too much for anyone to take seriously. By the end of the month, Karen had become a laughingstock, not just in Willowbrook Estates but across the entire county. Her name became synonymous with petty revenge gone wrong, and she eventually moved away in what many assumed was an attempt to escape her newfound infamy. As for John, he finally got what he'd been fighting for all along: peace and quiet on his farm. The inspectors stopped showing up unannounced. The airport project remained dead, and Karen Whitmore was nothing more than a distant memory. Sitting on his porch one evening with Bessie by his side and a slice of pie in hand, John couldn't help but smile at how things had turned out. "Looks like we won again," he said softly. Bessie mooed in agreement, and this time, there wasn't anyone around to complain about it. John had finally reached the point where he thought his life might return to normal. Karen Whitmore was gone. Her reign of HOA terror reduced to nothing but whispered jokes at neighborhood barbecues. The airport project was dead, buried under enough legal red tape to suffocate even the most ambitious developer. And John's farm was safe, untouched, and thriving. For the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe. But just as John was settling back into his routine, mending fences, tending to his crops, and occasionally yelling at squirrels, he received a phone call that would change everything. It was Marcus, and he sounded far too excited for John's liking. "John," Marcus said, his voice practically vibrating through the receiver. "You're not going to believe this." John sighed and leaned against his tractor. "Marcus, if this is about Karen filing another complaint about my cows, I swear." No, Marcus interrupted. "It's not about Karen. It's about the HOA." John frowned. "What about them?" "They're being audited," Marcus said, his tone dripping with glee. John blinked. "Audited? By who?" "The IRS," Marcus replied. For a moment, John didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The IRS auditing the HOA felt like poetic justice, a karmic slap delivered by the universe itself. "How did this happen?" John asked. "Well," Marcus began, clearly enjoying himself. "It turns out Karen wasn't just bad at running an HOA. She was also bad at keeping track of finances. The IRS caught wind of some irregularities in their tax filings, probably related to all those community donations she promised developers. And now they're digging through everything." John couldn't help but smile. "Looks like karma finally caught up with her." "Oh, it gets better," Marcus said. "They're not just auditing the HOA. They're investigating Karen personally." John let out a low whistle. "She's really in deep now." "She is," Marcus confirmed. "And here's the best part. They've subpoenaed all her emails and financial records." John laughed so hard he nearly dropped the phone. "You mean all those shady deals she tried to hide?" "Exactly," Marcus said. "And you're going to love this. They've already found evidence that she misused HOA funds for personal expenses." "Personal expenses?" John repeated. "Designer handbags, spa treatments, first-class flights, you name it," Marcus said. John shook his head in disbelief. "She really thought she could get away with all that?" "She did," Marcus replied. "But not anymore." Over the next few weeks, News of the IRS investigation spread like wildfire through Willowbrook Estates. Residents who had once turned a blind eye to Karen's antics were now openly criticizing her, and some were even demanding refunds for their HOA dues. "I knew something was fishy when she started driving that new sports car," one resident said during an impromptu neighborhood meeting. "And those dolphin-shaped hedges?" another added. "Do you know how much those cost?" As more details emerged about Karen's financial misdeeds, John couldn't help but feel vindicated. She had tried to ruin his life, but in the end, she had ruined her own. But then something unexpected happened. The residents of Willowbrook Estates began turning to John for advice. "You stood up to her," one neighbor said during a visit to his farm. "You knew how to fight back. You should run for HOA president," another suggested. John nearly choked on his coffee when he heard that last one. "Me? Run for HOA president? I don't even live in your neighborhood." "That doesn't matter," they insisted. "You know how to get things done." John laughed and shook his head. "Thanks, but no thanks. I've had enough of HOA drama to last a lifetime." Despite his refusal to get involved, John couldn't escape the fact that he had become something of a local hero, a symbol of resistance against suburban tyranny. People started stopping by his farm just to thank him for standing up to Karen, and some even brought him homemade pies as tokens of appreciation. One evening, as John sat on his porch enjoying yet another slice of pie, this one apple cinnamon, Marcus called with more news. "John," Marcus began, sounding amused as always. "You're not going to believe this." "What now?" John asked. "The IRS investigation uncovered something big, something that could change everything." John frowned. "What do you mean?" "They found evidence that Karen wasn't acting alone," Marcus explained. "She had help from other members of the HOA board." John raised an eyebrow. "You mean they were all in on it?" "Not all of them," Marcus clarified, "but enough to make it clear that this wasn't just Karen's doing." John leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "Looks like the whole operation is falling apart." "It is," Marcus confirmed. "And here's where it gets interesting. Some of those board members are trying to cut deals with investigators, offering information in exchange for leniency." John chuckled darkly. "So they're turning on each other now?" "Exactly," Marcus said. Over the next few days, more revelations came to light about the inner workings of Willowbrook Estates HOA, and none of them were good. Fraudulent contracts, embezzlement schemes, secret kickbacks, it was like something out of a bad soap opera. By the time the dust settled, several board members had resigned in disgrace, and Karen was facing criminal charges for tax evasion and fraud. As for John, he finally felt like justice had been served, not just for him but for everyone who had been affected by Karen's reign of terror. Sitting on his porch one evening with Bessie by his side and yet another slice of pie in hand, this one pecan, John couldn't help but smile at how things had turned out. "Looks like we won again," he said softly. Bessie mooed in agreement. And this time, there wasn't anyone around to complain about it. John's life had finally returned to the kind of peace he'd always cherished. The cows were mooing contentedly, the crops were thriving, and Karen Whitmore was now a cautionary tale whispered in HOA meetings across the county. The IRS investigation had dismantled the corrupt HOA board, and Karen herself was facing charges that would likely keep her too busy to meddle in anyone's life for a long time. For John, it was the perfect ending to a saga he hadn't asked for but had fought tooth and nail to survive. But John wasn't just content with surviving. He wanted to make sure no one else would ever have to deal with the kind of nonsense he'd endured. So, in a move that surprised even himself, he decided to turn his farm into something more than just a patch of land. He decided it was time for a little community outreach. The first step was simple. John put up a sign at the edge of his property that read, "Welcome to Thompson Farms, where HOA drama ends and real life begins." It was meant as a joke, but within days, people started showing up. Not just neighbors but folks from all over the county who had heard about his battle with Karen and wanted to see the legendary farm for themselves. At first, John wasn't sure what to do with all the attention. People were taking selfies with his cows, asking him for advice on how to deal with their own HOA nightmares, and even bringing him baked goods as thanks for standing up to suburban tyranny. One woman brought him an entire lasagna, which he accepted graciously despite not knowing what to do with it. Marcus, ever the opportunist, saw potential in all this. "John," he said one afternoon as they sat on the porch eating lasagna, "you've got something here. People love your story. They see you as a symbol of resistance." John raised an eyebrow. "Resistance? I'm just a farmer who didn't want an airport on his land." "Exactly," Marcus said. "You're relatable. You're authentic. You're what people need right now." John snorted. "What are you saying? I should run for office?" Marcus laughed. "Not quite. But you could do something bigger, something that helps people deal with their own HOA problems." John thought about it for a moment before shrugging. "I don't know anything about HOAs except how much I hate them." "Which makes you perfect," Marcus replied. "You're not part of the system. You're the guy who beat it." And so, Thompson Farms became more than just a farm. It became a sanctuary for HOA refugees. John set up a small community center in his barn where people could come and share their stories, get legal advice, courtesy of Marcus, and enjoy homemade pie while venting about their neighborhood woes. He also started hosting workshops on topics like how to read HOA bylaws without losing your sanity, and 5 ways to politely tell your HOA president to buzz off. The workshops were surprisingly popular, drawing attendees from as far away as neighboring counties. But John's favorite part of this new venture was hearing people's stories. Some were hilarious, others infuriating, but all of them reminded him why he'd fought so hard to protect his farm. One man told him about how his HOA had fined him $500 for planting sunflowers instead of regulation-approved roses. Another woman shared how her HOA had tried to ban her from putting up Christmas lights because they weren't aesthetically pleasing. And then there was the guy whose HOA had insisted he paint his mailbox beige even though it was already beige. Through it all, John listened patiently, offered advice when he could, and made sure everyone left with a slice of pie and a smile. Word spread quickly about Thompson Farms' new mission, and before long, John found himself at the center of something much bigger than he'd ever imagined. Local news outlets started covering his workshops. Social media exploded with posts about his farm, and people began calling him the anti-HOA farmer. John took it all in stride. He wasn't looking for fame or glory. He just wanted to help people avoid the kind of nightmare he'd lived through. But Marcus saw an opportunity. "You know what you need?" Marcus said one day as they stood by the barn watching people file in for a workshop on how to survive HOA elections without losing your soul. "What's that?" John asked. "A YouTube channel," Marcus replied. John stared at him blankly. "A what?" "A YouTube channel," Marcus repeated enthusiastically. "You can share your story, give advice, maybe even review pie recipes. It'll be great." John laughed. "Nobody wants to watch me talk about HOAs." "They do," Marcus insisted. "Trust me. People love this stuff." And so, reluctantly at first but with Marcus's encouragement and technical assistance, John launched Thompson Farms TV. The channel featured everything from tips on dealing with difficult neighbors to behind-the-scenes footage of life on the farm, and yes, occasional pie reviews. To John's surprise, the channel took off almost immediately. People loved his no-nonsense approach and dry humor, and they especially loved seeing Bessie make cameo appearances in nearly every video. Within months, Thompson Farms TV had thousands of subscribers, and John found himself fielding questions from viewers all over the country who wanted advice on everything from HOA disputes to farming techniques. Through it all, John remained humble, even as Marcus started jokingly referring to him as America's favorite farmer. He knew that none of this would have happened if Karen Whitmore hadn't tried to bulldoze her way across his land, and while he didn't exactly thank her for it, he couldn't deny that she'd inadvertently helped him find his true calling. As John sat on his porch one evening reflecting on everything that had happened, from fighting off bulldozers to becoming an accidental YouTube star, he couldn't help but smile. Life had thrown him into chaos, but somehow he'd come out stronger, and with more pie recipes than he knew what to do with. And so, as always, John raised his glass, this time filled with lemonade, and toasted to victory. Not just for himself but for everyone who'd ever stood up against suburban tyranny. If you enjoyed this story and want more tips on how to survive your own HOA drama, or just want some good old-fashioned farming wisdom, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, leave a comment below about your craziest HOA experience.